Okay, let's dive into a really intense couple of days in Los Angeles County recently.
Yeah, quite a situation unfolded.
You probably saw some headlines, federal agents, protests, clashes. We're going to unpack that.
Exactly. We're focusing on these U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE operations on Friday, June 6th and Saturday, June 7th, 2025.
And the community reaction, which was pretty immediate and forceful.
Absolutely. It led to some significant confrontations.
So to get a handle on this, we've pulled together quite a few sources. Local news, obviously KIS FM, Long Beach Post, FOX11, NBC LA.
Right. And also some other outlets like the Post Millennial, The Independent, Ground News for Analysis.
We even have some briefing document bits and a peek into a social media discussion on Reddit from Rice on Us.
Yeah, people were discussing video footage there.
So our goal here really is to cut through the noise. We want to lay out the timeline from these sources, what actions people reportedly took, and importantly, the very different ways these events were described.
Just give you the clear picture based on the material we have in front of us.
Okay, so let's start at the trigger. Friday, June 6th. What do the sources say kicked things off?
Well, the reports describe these large-scale ICE operations starting early Friday.
Large scale, meaning not just one or two spots.
No, definitely widespread. Concentrated in downtown LA and the Westlake area initially.
Any specific places mentioned?
Yeah, sources point to a clothing warehouse in the garment district. Also, some activity potentially near Home Depot locations and around a federal detention center. It felt coordinated.
Okay. And what was the official reason? What did ICE and federal authorities say they were doing?
The line reported consistently was enforcing immigration laws, targeting individuals for violations.
Just general enforcement or more specific?
More specific,
Yeah.
actually. IC Acting Director Todd Lyons is quoted saying the focus was on criminal illegal aliens.
Okay.
He listed examples like gang members, drug traffickers, people with histories of assault, domestic violence, robbery, things like that.
And so framing it as a public safety issue, targeting criminals.
Pretty much. And U.S. Attorney Bill Asaley also mentioned some operations were based on lawful judicial warrants.
Warrants for what?
Specifically at work sites, looking into potential use of fictitious documents by employers.
Right. And there was broader context mentioned too, something about a national push.
Yeah, one source, FOX11, places within a bigger picture a reported Trump administration effort to, really ramp up immigration arrests nationwide.
Ramp up how much?
Well, that source cited internal data suggesting a really dramatic increase and even mentioned a goal attributed to figures like Stephen Miller of hitting 3,000 arrests per day nationally.
Wow, 3,000 a day. That's a huge number. Puts these LA raids in perspective.
It definitely gives context to the scale of the effort described.
So what was the immediate result on Friday in LA? How many arrests?
The sources say over 40 individuals were arrested on Friday for immigration violations.
And the impact on the ground?
Described as chaos in downtown LA by at least one report, so definitely disruptive right from the start.
Okay, over 40 arrests. Official focus on criminals, claims of chaos. Then came the response, right? How did the protest start?
Almost immediately. As news of the raids and arrests got out, sources mentioned organizers spreading the word online. Very quickly, people started gathering.
So spontaneous protests Friday.
Yeah, Friday saw protests pop up right where the raids were happening, downtown LA and Westlake. Direct response.
And it didn't stop there. Saturday saw things escalate.
It absolutely did. ICE activity reportedly continued, and the protests grew larger and more confrontational on Saturday.
Where was the focus then?
A lot of the attention Saturday shifted to the area near a Home Depot in Paramount.
Was there a raid at the Home Depot?
Sources are a bit mixed. Some suggest it might have been more of a staging area for agents, maybe processing people. But its presence definitely drew a big crowd of demonstrators.
And that led to clashes.
Yeah, what's described as an hours-long confrontation happened there.
Let's get into what the protesters were reportedly doing. What actions do the sources describe?
It's a real range.
Yeah.
Started with gathering, chanting slogans, whose streets, our streets, Fura ICE, things like that.
Standard protest actions. But it went beyond that.
Yes. Reports mentioned demonstrators trying to block federal vehicles, including a U.S. Marshal's bus, overturning shopping carts, using other objects to create blockades in the street.
And direct confrontation.
Definitely. Sources consistently report objects being thrown at agents and vehicles. Rocks are specifically mentioned.
Okay. Anything else? Any fires?
Some reports mention small fires being set near the Home Depot or like a bag of trash lit on fire in the street.
So actions ranging from chanting to physical obstruction and throwing things.
Exactly. And you see this reflected in how protesters are described in the sources. Some are called peaceful protesters.
Others?
Others are labeled anti-ICE activists, alleged agitators, even rioters or violent anti-IC rioters.
That's quite a range of labels.
It really is. One source specifically mentions vandalism at a federal detention center, anti-IC graffiti, including death threats.
Wow. Any visual descriptions? Flags, shields?
Yeah, some reports noted protesters carrying Mexican flags and others using things like cardboard as makeshift shields.
Okay, so that's the protester side. What about the federal agents? How did they respond to this level of confrontation?
Well, the clashes themselves are described as tense, confrontational, and at times violent. You see pictures in the sources of agents, ICE, Border Patrol, and tactical gear.
Like riot gear?
Pretty much, yeah. Gas masks, helmets, forming skirmish lines to control the crowd.
And what tactics did they use for crowd control?
Various methods are reported. Flashbang grenades were mentioned for both Friday downtown and Saturday in Paramount.
Flashbangs. Okay, what else?
Pepper spray reportedly used on Friday. Then on Saturday, more reports of flashbang smoke grenades and tear gas.
Tear gas, too. Any use of projectiles?
Several sources mention agents firing non-lethal munitions, targeted at people described as agitators.
Non-lethal, like beanbags?
Yes. In fact, one specific protester reported being hit multiple times with beanbag rounds on Saturday.
So definitely a physical engagement with crowd control weapons.
No doubt. And the federal perspective, as reported, really emphasizes the intensity they felt they were facing.
How so?
You see quotes about agents being faced off with violent anti-IC rioters, being vastly outnumbered. One account even claims over 1,000 rioters surrounded and attacked a federal building.
1,000? Wow. That paints a picture of being under siege.
That's certainly the narrative presented from their side in these sources.
Now, besides the initial immigration arrests on Friday, were people arrested during the protests themselves for actions taken there?
Yes, definitely. Separate arrests related to the protests occurred.
Anyone notable?
A big one on Friday was David Huerta. He's the president of SCIU California, the big union.
Why was he arrested?
Charged with impeding a federal agent. Sources say he was trying to document the raids when it happened.
Did he make a statement?
Yeah, widely quoted. He basically said it wasn't about him personally, but about hardworking people being treated like criminals. He framed it as a larger injustice.
Okay. And arrests continued Saturday.
They did. Reports mention multiple other protesters arrested in Paramount for obstruction or for, quote, blocking or pushing members of law enforcement.
Any official comment on those arrests?
FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino is quoted talking about arrests for obstruction. He also mentioned efforts to identify specific people, like a man filmed throwing rocks.
Did he issue a warning?
A pretty direct one, yeah. You bring chaos and we'll bring handcuffs.
Clear message there. Were there injuries reported among protesters?
The sources mentioned at least one protester reported injured on Saturday in Paramount, linked to those non-lethal munitions used by agents.
Okay, so arrests, confrontations, tactics, injuries. This brings us to the core conflict and how this was all interpreted, right? The differing perspectives.
Exactly. And this is where you really need to pay attention to the sources because the viewpoints reported are just polar opposites. We have to be careful just to report what they said.
Let's start with the federal side again. How did authorities justify the raids and frame the protests in the sources?
Consistently, they frame their actions as lawful, necessary immigration enforcement, targeting criminals, using warrants. That was the message from Escalated and Lyons.
And the protests?
Framed as obstruction, as attacks on agents trying to do their jobs. Both Escalated and Bongino are quoted condemning the actions, warning obstruction leads to arrest.
What kind of language did they use to describe the protests overall?
Pretty strong language.
Yeah.
ICE Director Lyons called it chaos and lawlessness.
Okay.
And Stephen Miller, the White House advisor, reportedly went further, calling the protests an insurrection against the laws and sovereignty of the United States.
Insurrection, that's a very heavy term.
Extremely. Miller also framed it as people siding with invaders over citizens. Really stark language.
And there was criticism of local officials, too.
Yeah, Director Lyons specifically called out L.A. Mayor Karen Bass, accusing her of siding with chaos and lawlessness over law enforcement because she condemned the raids.
So, the federal narrative. Lawful enforcement met by unlawful, even insurrectionist opposition. how did local officials and community leaders see it, according to the sources?
Completely differently. Leaders like Mayor Bass, Long Beach Mayor Richardson, Congresswoman Barragan, they strongly condemned the ICE operations, and particularly the tactics.
What was their main objection?
The impact on the community. Mayor Bass said the raids were meant to sow terror. Mayor Richardson called them deeply troubling, actions that instill fear and damage trust. Barragan spoke of terror tactics and masked agents.
So the focus was on fear and the methods used.
Very much so. The tactics were a huge issue. Senator Schiff and Padilla, other representatives, they called for an investigation into the federal tactics.
And the whole sanctuary city context came up.
It did. Sources mentioned L.A. being a self-designated sanctuary city. They quote LAPD, the Sheriff's Department, reference Long Beach policy, all saying local police don't do civil immigration enforcement, highlighting the contrast with federal actions.
How did this side view the protesters then? And someone like David Huerta?
They defended them, framed the actions as resistance. Ren Gochez from Union del Barrio called Saturday a beautiful day of resistance, saying they were stopping agents from kidnapping our people.
So resistance, not rioting.
Exactly. And Huerta was seen as wrongfully arrested for just observing, for peaceful action. His own statement about standing against injustice was echoed by supporters.
Wow. It's just two completely different realities being described in these sources. Lawful enforcement versus terror tactics. Obstruction versus resistance.
It really shows how the same set of events can be interpreted in fundamentally opposing ways depending on your perspective and priorities. Federal authority versus community impact.
Yeah, it really highlights the narrative battle. How did the different media sources we looked at reflect these contrasts in their framing?
You could definitely see a difference. Some outlets, that the Post-Millennial mentioned earlier, led with headlines focusing on protester actions. Rioters attack ICE agents, that sort of thing. Other local news, while covering the clashes, often framed it more around protests sparked by raids, giving that initial context more prominence.
And the Reddit discussion.
That offered another layer. Very strong anti-ICE sentiment, as you might expect. Lots of charged language about the agents, but also users expressing concerns that mainstream media wasn't showing the full picture, maybe downplaying protester grievances.
So social media acting as its own filter and amplifier.
Right. Showing how these narratives get shaped and reinforced within different online spaces.
Okay, so pulling this all together from the sources, what are the main takeaways for you?
I think the absolute core is this clash between federal authority carrying out its stated mission, enforcing immigration law, targeting criminals, and the community response, viewing those actions as harmful, terrifying, and unjust.
Leading to direct confrontation.
Exactly. And then these confrontations are interpreted through completely opposite lenses. Lawful enforcement versus illegitimate resistance, or necessary resistance versus unlawful rioting. The language itself becomes part of the conflict.
And looking at all these sources side by side really drives home how tricky it is to navigate this stuff today, doesn't it? You have to see the different angles, the different framing to get anywhere close to a full understanding.
Absolutely. It makes you question why certain words are chosen, what story each source is actually telling.
So based on everything we've seen in these reports, here's something to think about. Federal officials insist the right to protest ends where attacking officers or obstructing lawful work begins. But some protesters and community voices quoted here see their actions against agents as legitimate, necessary resistance to what they call terror tactics.
Yeah, two fundamentally incompatible views on authority and resistance.
So the question is, how do these deeply clashing ideas about what constitutes lawful authority versus what counts as legitimate resistance fuel such volatile and intense confrontations like the ones described in these sources?